He is alone in the room, and he is not painting on canvas. He is painting directly onto the plaster wall of his own dining room, in oil mixed straight into the surface, and what is forming under his brush is a giant tearing the body of his own child apart with its teeth. There is no commission for this work. There is no buyer waiting outside. There is no plan for anyone ever to walk into this room and see it. The man holding the brush is 73 years old, profoundly deaf, living in near isolation on the outskirts of Madrid, and when he finally steps back from the wall, he will never give this painting a name, never sign it, and never leave behind a single documented sentence explaining what it means. 13 more paintings just like it are about to appear on the walls around him. None of them were requested by anyone alive. All of them are about to vanish from public knowledge for more than 50 years, sealed inside a house that history will eventually tear down completely. The man is Francisco Goya, and by 1819 he was already one of the most celebrated painters in Europe. He had been first court painter to the Spanish crown, portraitist to kings, queens, and generals, a man whose earlier commissions had made him wealthy, respected, and internationally known. That February, he purchased a modest 2-story farmhouse on the banks of the Manzanares River just outside Madrid, with views across the plains of San Isidro. The property already carried a nickname before Goya ever crossed its threshold: Quinta del Sordo, the House of the Deaf Man, named after a previous owner who had lost his hearing decades earlier. Goya himself had gone profoundly deaf 27 years before, in 1792, after a mysterious illness that nearly killed him and was never formally diagnosed. He moved into a house already named for a condition he shared, and something in him had already begun to change. He did not begin painting on the walls immediately. Historians studying the property's records believe the murals were started sometime after September 1819, likely following a second severe illness that almost killed him again that winter. An episode he documented obliquely in a self-portrait showing himself in bed, attended by his physician Dr. Eugenio Garcia Arrieta. What is not in dispute is this: underneath several of the black paintings, conservators have found an earlier layer: light, rural, almost cheerful landscape scenes painted before the darkness went up over them. Goya covered his own earlier work, or someone else's, in black. Between roughly 1820 and 1823, 14 murals took shape across 2 rooms of that house, 7 on the ground floor, 8 on the upper floor, according to the inventory later compiled by the painter Antonio Brugada, a friend of Goya's who catalogued the works after his death. Not one of them was commissioned. Not one was exhibited. Not one is mentioned in a single surviving letter Goya is known to have written. Art historians who have spent entire careers on Spanish Romantic painting return to this detail again and again. There is no documented explanation, from Goya or from anyone who knew him personally, for why these paintings exist at all. Saturn Devouring His Son occupied the dining room, the room where Goya would have eaten his meals, day after day, across the table from an image of a god devouring his own son. Nearby hung 2 old men eating, positioned according to the writer Charles Irarte, directly beside the very door through which the kitchen staff carried dishes in and out, a joke or a warning placed exactly where food entered the room. The other murals were no gentler. A dog nearly swallowed by an ocean of empty ochre space, its head tilted upward at something that is never shown. 2 elderly men, either laughing or screaming, leaning toward each other in a field with no horizon. A crowd of faces gathered in darkness around a shape that has never been fully explained. Here is what almost every documentary gets wrong: that Goya titled these paintings himself, and that he intended them as some kind of final artistic testament, a message left on purpose for the world. He did not, and there is no evidence he did. The names we use today, Saturn Devouring His Son among them, were assigned decades after Goya's death by Brugada, working from his own interpretation of images that had never been labeled. Goya left behind no title, no key, no explanation, and, according to the surviving historical record, not one recorded comment to anyone about what he had covered his own walls with. In September 1823, the political ground in Spain shifted violently. King Ferdinand VII crushed the liberal government known as the Trienio Liberal and began prosecuting its former sympathizers, a group that included people close to Goya, a man whose own politics had never sat comfortably with the absolutist crown. On the 17th of that month, Goya transferred legal ownership of the Quinta del Sordo to his 17-year-old grandson Mariano, and within months he left Spain for Bordeaux, France, at nearly 78 years old. He never returned to live in that house again. He died in Bordeaux in 1828. The murals stayed exactly where he had left them, sealed inside a private home on the edge of Madrid, essentially unseen by the public, for the next 4 decades. The first outside witness to leave a written account was the French writer Charles Iriarte, who visited the house in 1867 while researching an early biography of Goya. By then, at least one of the 14 murals described in Brugada's inventory was already gone, a painting known today as Heads in a Landscape, which Iriarte reported had already been removed from the wall and installed in the Marquis of Salamanca's nearby palace before he ever arrived. It survives today in a private American collection, permanently separated from the other 13, and it is rarely mentioned in any account of the black paintings at all. What Iriarte saw and described on the remaining walls became, for the next century, the primary written record of how the rooms had actually looked, because photography had not yet been used to document them and no one else had bothered to write any of it down. The house changed hands more than once before a French banker, Baron Frédéric-Émile d'Erlanger, purchased it in 1873, nearly half a century after Goya's death. In 1874, he commissioned the photographer Jean Laurent to document the murals in place before having them physically cut away from the plaster and mounted onto canvas by the restorer Salvador Martínez Cubells, a violent, experimental process that risked destroying every one of them permanently. Laurent's photographs, taken just before the walls were cut open, remain the only visual record of exactly how the paintings looked while they were still murals, still inside the house Goya had lived and eaten in. Comparing those photographs to the finished canvases in the Prado today, conservators have found real differences. Duel with Cudgels, for instance, appears in Laurent's 1874 photograph to show 2 men fighting in a field of tall grass, while the version now hanging in Madrid shows them buried to the knees in what looks like mud or quicksand. A shift that may have come from restoration, from deterioration, or from decisions made silently during the transfer itself. The paintings were shown publicly for the first time at the Paris Exposition Universelle in 1878, then donated to the Museo del Prado in 1881, where Saturn Devouring His Son hangs today, viewed by millions of visitors who assume they are looking at Goya's exact, unaltered original brushwork. And here is where the story stops being simple. In 2003, the Spanish architectural historian Juan José Junquera published research examining property and legal records tied to the Quinta del Sordo. His conclusion was explosive. Contemporary documents describing the house appear to record it as a single-story building throughout Goya's ownership, with the second floor, where roughly half of the black paintings were supposedly located, not added until after his death. If Junquera's reading of those records is correct, some of the most famous paintings in Spanish art history could not have been painted by the man whose name is on every wall label in the Prado. The rebuttal came from the British Goya scholar Nigel Glendinning, who argued the property documents Junquera relied on were ambiguous rather than conclusive, and who separately questioned whether Goya's son, Javier, the alternative candidate some have quietly floated as a possible author of the upper floor murals, ever produced any signed painting capable of supporting that theory at all. The Prado has not changed its attribution. Most Goya scholars still consider the traditional account correct. But the disagreement is real. It is published, and it has never been formally resolved. What is not disputed is stranger than the controversy itself. Goya shared that house with a much younger woman, Leocadia Weiss, still legally married to another man, and possibly with her young daughter, Rosario, a child some historians believe may have been Goya's own, though no document proves it either way. A deaf, aging, politically exposed man, living in near isolation with a much younger companion and a child of uncertain parentage, painting monstrous, wordless images onto the walls of the rooms they shared their meals in, for reasons he never once explained. In 1909, the Quinta del Sordo itself was demolished. The walls that had held 13 of the 14 murals no longer physically exist anywhere on Earth. Only the canvases cut from them in 1873 survive, hanging today under museum lighting in an order and arrangement that is itself a reconstruction based on Brugada's memory, Iriarte's notes, and Laurent's photographs, because no floor plan of the original rooms has ever been found. Saturn is still in that dining room, in a sense, relocated to Madrid, framed, cataloged, seen by more people in a single afternoon than ever saw it in Goya's lifetime. But the house it was painted for no longer exists. One of its 14 siblings sits in a private collection nobody visits, and the man who made it took every explanation with him to Bordeaux. What was he actually trying to say to the only two people who ever ate dinner across from that painting? And what does it mean that 2 centuries later, historians are still arguing not just about why it was painted, but about whether the hand we've always blamed for it was even the right one?